philosophers for hundreds of years talked about mental representation, but there wasn't the science that they could draw on of mental representation. So it was really just armchair. I don't want to say speculation, because it was grounded in introspection and in tight arguments, but there wasn't an experimental basis for it.
Still in an armchair, yeah.
Yeah, it was still in an armchair, exactly. By and large, the most central concept of representation in philosophy has been the idea that the mind represents the world as being a certain way. And this is really the essence of representation. Turing was a brilliant logician and a brilliant thinker, one of the greatest thinkers of the 20th century.
That's a safe statement.
Yeah, that's a safe statement. But
this is Brain Inspired.
How are the physical things and processes in our skulls related to the things that they purportedly represent? How do the layers of a neural network relate to what they represent? What does it mean to represent something, and is representation necessary to explain intelligence? Hello, everyone. I'm Paul Middlebrooks. Lots of spoken words and ink and keyboard tapping have been spent on these questions. In neuroscience and AI, we often use the word representation rather loosely, to be generous. And this has been well documented, and I am definitely guilty of it. But in philosophy, the concept of representation has been pondered forever, basically, and it's still at the heart of many debates in the literature. That's right, good people. We're talking about representation and its role in philosophy, neuroscience, and AI. And I convinced Michael Rescorla to help me sort it all out today. Michael's a professor of philosophy at UCLA, where he works on philosophy of mind and science and computation, and as you'll hear, he also has deep interests in Bayesian approaches to cognition and spatial navigation. So he has a good grasp on many subjects in neuroscience and in cognition. We take a winding path during our discussion and talk about the nature of representation, the role of philosophy in general, levels of computational explanation, and we talk at length about the role of representation in computation in minds and in machines. If you have a philosophical bent like me, you will enjoy this, I think. I apologize to those of you who don't, however. One of the reasons I had Michael on is because I'll be talking next episode about representations with respect to analyzing brain activity and deep neural network activity. That'll be with Jørn Didriksen and Nico Kriegeskorte. So this episode hopefully will serve as some sort of primer for that upcoming episode as well. Quick update on the Brain Inspired course. I aim to have the first module ready and released by mid-March. It'll cover roughly the zoo of neural networks that are being used today and how they relate to brains and how and whether they're good models of neural circuits. So it'll be the first version of that with many other modules to come after that. Jürgen, Artie, Jacob, Joe, Jeff, and Asia, I hope I'm pronouncing that correctly, you guys and the rest of you who support the show on Patreon will of course be getting the course as it's made and helping me improve it. So I'll keep you posted as progress occurs, and thank you so much for your support on Patreon. During our conversation, Michael suggests multiple books during today's episode, and I'll link to those in the show notes, as well as the handful of Michael's work that we covered today, and I'll link to his website as well, where he has links to the rest of his work. His writing is really clear and enjoyable, so you should check it out. I've really enjoyed diving deep into all of his work. Show notes are at braininspired.co/podcast/60. All right, here's my conversation with Michael Rescorla. When I was, I think maybe 13, maybe 12, 13, 14, my friend and I would ride our bikes up to the local pool. We'll call it a public pool. It wasn't quite public, but he and I were swimming in this pool, and across the way there are these two cute girls, and they were like looking at us, and they kind of, we were shy. They swam over to us. We were, kind of excited about this. And once they got over, one of the girls said to me, when we were over there, we came over because we thought you were cute, but now that we're closer, we see it's your friend that's the cute one. And and I feel like in that story, sometimes I feel like I am philosophy and my friend is neuroscience sometimes. And this is a terrible way to introduce a philosopher to the program, I know, but it gets better. Thank you, Michael, for being here, and welcome.
It's a pleasure to be here.
So, can you be my therapist for just a minute here before we get into things? A quick therapy session, okay? Because I have a challenging relationship with philosophy, and I love it. So I'm preparing this course on sort of the interface of neuroscience and AI. And I'm going through like the different types of neural networks that are kind of popular these days as models for brain processing. And I'm reading about the philosophy of models and modeling. It's great. You read about how models can be descriptive. They're used to predict things. They can have explanatory power and so on. And then I start getting into the ontology of models, like what is a model? And I start reading about like the fictional view of models that equates models to something that a writer creates like Sherlock Holmes. And 5 minutes later, I'm reading about what fiction really is. And then I think, where am I? How did I get here? How was I taken here by this philosophy? And all of a sudden, I'm upset at philosophy for wasting my time. I could have just been using a model, right? And actually doing stuff instead of dancing around the idea of it. But, a different time, I'm also working on the course. I'm reading about the computational theory of mind and representations. And how do networks of neurons or artificial networks of neurons represent things, and how we get from neurons and circuits to the content that they represent. And it's all relevant and it seems important, and I'm happy again with philosophy. Is this something I'm just going to have to accept in my relationship with philosophy?
I think philosophy is really like any discipline. Some of the work is better than others. Some is more helpful than others, and some will address the concerns you have going into it and others will not. So just like in math, you might get really into topology and not be so interested in number theory, or you might be really interested in probability theory and not interested in algebraic geometry. So there are different things are to different people's tastes. So it sounds like maybe the general philosophy of science literature that you were alluding to in the first part of your question about the natures of scientific explanation, the nature of scientific modeling, that's not your cup of tea, but there's still a lot else that's out there in philosophy besides that. I have to say, I like that general philosophy of science literature that you're alluding to,
well,
but not everyone. Yeah. But it's not, I can see why if you're coming at this where your concern is the mind or the brain, doing neural network modeling of the mind or talking about AI, why those sorts of general philosophy of science questions might not interest you. But I do think there's a lot in philosophy that is relevant. And you were touching on it at the end of your question there. So the notion of mental representation, I think, has been a really central one to philosophy for
forever.
Over 1,000 years. I mean, a really long time. And philosophers have had a lot to say about it. And a lot of what they have said has trickled into the discussion of it in AI, in cognitive psychology.
Yeah.
And I think it can continue to inform it. So I think if you look in the right place, you do find a lot of work that connects with more of the kinds of concerns that you're interested in, such as research on the computational theory of mind, the representational theory of mind.
So, it seems like, and I should say I'm not talking to, quote unquote, just a philosopher here, because you're interested in, Bayesian approaches to understanding computation and mental representations and brains, and we'll get into all that. But it seems like there have been waves of popularity of philosophy among scientists over the years. So if you go back to 1912, you have Bertrand Russell extolling the virtues and the values of philosophy, saying that, it shows you can use philosophy to show unexpected possibilities and things. And he talks about freeing us from the tyranny of custom, meaning the way that we generally conceive of things is probably not the way the things really are. And, we can free ourselves from that. He also likes the idea of it relieving us from our trivial concerns of the day. Like, I don't need to remind myself for the 18th time, What do I need to make for dinner tonight, for instance? And then fast forward, over 100 years, and now, and not that there's been one wave, but now I feel like there's this new wave of interest in philosophy from the scientists, and especially from the science of brains and minds and intelligence. And you have like papers coming out, like there was one in 2019 that listed 4 or 5, virtues for roles of philosophy in science. Things like clarifying scientific concepts, critically assessing some assumptions and so on. And it's been a trend, I think, I know this is a long rant here, but it's been a trend, I think, for a while now for philosophy to take scientific practice as a starting point and use how science is actually done by practicing scientists to then start asking philosophical questions. And that's something that you do, and you do well. First of all, is this an approach, this last approach I was just talking about, using the practice of science, is this an approach that was brought in because of Thomas Kuhn from The Structure of Scientific Revolutions and his ideas? I mean, and if so, like, how did it differ previous to that, and why is it a popular method now?
So I think there are several different ways that philosophy relates to the sciences of the mind. One that you were gesturing to before is as a source of ideas or concepts. So the notion of a mental representation is a good example where you see this playing such a central role, the idea that there are mental representations, that the mind has a capacity to represent the world. Going back to the medieval era, then in the 19th century, Hermann von Helmholtz, really when he helps to found perceptual psychology, he puts this idea of mental representations, he calls them ideas, but it's the same basic idea. It's these mental items that represent the world. And that's quite central to a lot of his formulations and the way that he looks at it. In the modern era of the cognitive science revolution, talk about mental representations is just rampant. So these are ideas that are emanating from philosophy and migrating over to the sciences. So there's that aspect of this. It's a source of ideas. Then there's the other aspect that you mentioned, that it can help with conceptual clarification. So, for example, this Bayesian modeling of the mind, Bayesian decision theory is a normative framework that basically gives you mathematical tools for modeling, reasoning, and decision making under uncertain conditions. And it starts out in philosophy and in the work of mathematicians, scientists such as Laplace in the 19th century, really as a normative framework. Like, we're going to use this to try to make good, rational inferences about the world using the tools of Bayesian decision theory. But then in the last few decades, especially, you see cognitive scientists using it as a descriptive tool where maybe the mind actually is doing Bayesian inference. So something like these Bayesian norms are being implemented or at least approximated by the mind. And this is something that philosophy has a lot to say about, because the central notion of Bayesian decision theory, for example, is the idea that agents have subjective probabilities, that they attach credences to hypotheses about the world. So the credence would basically be the degree of belief that you have that a hypothesis is true. So if you're on a jury and you're trying to decide, is the defendant innocent or not, you might have a certain degree of belief. Well, probably he's innocent, but I'm not sure. So, and in Bayesian decision theory, you have a quantitative measure of this sort of thing, of the degree to which you believe something. So this notion of attaching a credence or a subjective probability to a hypothesis, which is so central to what's going on in the science, is something that philosophers have talked a lot about. So it's something that they can say and help to clarify what that is. Or another example in the same vein would be, these are supposed to be rational norms, like you're supposed to conform to these norms of Bayesian decision theory. If you conform to them, you're rational. If you don't conform to them, you're irrational in some sense. Well, okay, but why is that? Why are these norms so special as opposed to other norms? This is something philosophers have talked about endlessly for decades, and it's something that if scientists are naturally often, when you read these papers on Bayesian modeling, they'll start out by making normative claims, and it's something that people who want sort of a deeper understanding of the normative basis of Bayesian decision theory, they could look to the philosophical literature for really quite extensive discussion of this normative basis. But then there's also the last thing that you mentioned, which is that philosophy can learn from the science. So philosophers for hundreds of years talked about mental representation, but there wasn't the science that they could draw on of mental representation. So it was really just armchair. I don't want to say speculation, because it was grounded in introspection and in tight arguments, but there wasn't an experimental basis
It's
for it.
still in an armchair. Yeah.
Yeah, it was still in an armchair, exactly. So, but now there's thousands of people doing research on this notion of mental representation. We've learned a tremendous amount about it. So, for example, in my work, a lot of what I do is that I try to look at the scientific literature and say, okay, what does this tell us about how the mind works? How can this illuminate the questions that philosophers have been interested in about mental representation? So I'm sort of trying to do both in my work. I'm trying to contribute conceptual clarity when I can, and also trying to see what I can learn and what I can communicate to philosophers and what kinds of philosophical reflections I can make based on this scientific literature. To answer the other part of your question, I do think that Kuhn played a really important role in all this, in not just philosophy of cognitive science, but philosophy of science more generally, because he was so focused on scientific practice and looking at scientific practice as it is. And sometimes in the popular conception, Kuhn is branded as being almost anti-science, or he thought that people would say, oh, well, he thought that science was irrational because of these paradigm shifts that he likened to conversion experiences and when you change your religion. And there is that aspect to him. But if you read The Structure of Scientific Revolution, the vast bulk of it is really very close attention to the history of philosophy, just informed by enormous knowledge and respect for the way that these scientists are operating. And it helped, I think, to bring philosophers into touch with how much traction, how much mileage you can get from looking at the nitty-gritty of scientific practice.
I recommend the book, too. It's a short read, and I have to credit my advisor when I was a postdoc for making me read it. He has his little library, and he just threw it on my desk one day. I don't remember what I was doing wrong, but he...
It is a terrific book. When I teach philosophy of science, intro philosophy of science, I always spend at least 2 weeks going through it,
wow. Cool.
talking, just having the students read it and lecturing on it.
Yeah. Well, so you talked about, what you are contributing, what you're sort of wanting to contribute. So I mean, how do you feel like, how do you hope that your philosophy contributes to I guess, should we say cognitive science? Is that what you're most comfortable with? Biological science, or just the science of intelligence?
Cognitive science is a pretty good term, I think, just to describe this umbrella notion of these many different disciplines all in one way or another trying to understand the mind. I would even include AI, at least a lot of AI under that rubric, maybe not all the commercial applications, but a lot of AI is in the spirit of trying to understand at least how you might reverse engineer a mind. So in that sense, it's contributing to our understanding of how minds work. So yeah, I think cognitive science is a pretty standard term, a pretty good term for it.
So do you feel like your work is received? So what was the current state, do you think, of philosophy in the minds of practicing scientists? How do you feel received when you, because I know you interact a lot with practicing researchers.
I think that it varies. I think that it really varies from field to field and from researcher to researcher. I think that in psychology, at least a lot of people are very open to philosophy and are eager to interact with philosophers. So there's a professional organization called the Society for Philosophy and Psychology, which has an annual meeting, and that's attended equally by philosophers and psychologists.
And everyone's happy.
So yeah, it's not a combative meeting. It's a productive meeting where there's a lot of interaction and a lot really gets done there, and people come out of it feeling like they've learned from one another. Cool. I think that maybe in neuroscience there's probably a little bit more suspicion among philosophers. I don't want to frame it. Neuroscience is a huge field, but maybe there's a little bit less of a tradition because psychology does spin off of philosophy through Helmholtz, through William James. So there's just these historical roots that the two fields have always been. I
mean, we all spin off of philosophy, though. I mean, natural philosophy gave birth to science, essentially, right?
Sure, but if psychology is a more recent spin-off, I guess. I mean, neuroscience is really a lot of the work in neuroscience is coming maybe from a more biological tradition. So I think that it just varies, but certainly, like, I'm going to be going to a conference on philosophy and neuroscience this summer where it's going to be some neuroscientists, some philosophers. So it's not like it doesn't happen. It's just that maybe it's a little bit less common to encounter it. That's just my impression. But of course, I have a limited perspective. I think that maybe if you talked to philosophers who engage more than I do with neuroscience, and there are some philosophers who really get more into the nitty-gritty of the neuroscience than I do, maybe they would have a different impression. They would be talking more to neuroscientists than I do.
They're up for the battles in neuroscience. So from your I don't know, I was going to say perch. From your vantage point in, I guess, philosophy, for lack of a better term, how do you view the current state and sort of direction of the study of mental processes of AI and the study of neuroscience? Is everybody headed in the right direction? Is it just like watching a bunch of clowns running around a car, or what?
Definitely not the latter. Definitely not the clown car. No, I'm actually really excited about it. I think if you look at what's going on now, there's a lot of genuine progress being made. So the three areas that I know the most about, just because I've written about them, so I've just had to inform myself the most about them, are the study of perception. So here what you want to understand is, how do we perceive the world? How do we come to, for example, in the case of vision, come to see the world as it is, or at least roughly as it is? So for example, you're looking at a white wall. How do you come to see the wall as being white? What's going on in your mind?
Yeah.
And so there's been a lot of progress in understanding questions like that. Or just to give another example, you look at a cube, how do you come to see it as a cube? And this is a very hard problem, these sorts of problems. But hard problem for the mind to solve, and also hard for scientists to come to understand how the mind solves it.
Right.
So we mentioned Bayesian models before, and one of the most exciting trends, I think, is Bayesian modeling of perception, where people treat the perceptual system as, in effect, doing unconscious Bayesian inference. So it's not like you're consciously aware of doing some sort of probability calculation.
I mean, Helmholtz would love this.
Helmholtz would, exactly. So it comes directly from Helmholtz with the idea that perception does unconscious inference, and people doing Bayesian modeling of perception are definitely see themselves as continuing this Helmholtzian idea. And there's been a lot of empirical success from these models. I guess maybe even a better word would be explanatory success, because you get really impressive explanations of perceptual phenomena. So the second area that I know a fair amount about is motor control.
Yeah.
And so motor control, you're interested in the question, how do we move our bodies to achieve our goals? How does the motor system, you have an intention to do something, like I intend to go pick up a cup of coffee to drink it. Now, the job of my motor system is basically to make that happen. I've got to walk over to it. I've got to lift my arms. I've got to wrap my hands around the coffee cup. So how does that happen? Again, a very hard problem for the motor system to solve. You can see this because we basically can't even yet build robots that are able to do this, which is very, for anyone above the age of 8 or 6 or whatnot, is an extremely easy thing for them to do, to pick it up without spilling it. And again, you have Bayesian models that are given of this, where the motor system is in fact doing Bayesian computation, estimating its environment in Bayesian terms, doing expected utility calculations. And these are quite impressive as well. And the final area that I know the most about is navigation. So especially mammalian navigation. And the idea here that has proved quite successful is that mammals have something like a cognitive map, something like a map like mental representation in their heads of their spatial environment. So the animal is in a way representing how things are spatially laid out in its surroundings. And this idea is also yielding quite a lot of insights, I think. And in that area especially, there is a big neuroscience connection going back to the 70s with research on place cells, and now more recently work on grid cells. So this was work that won the Nobel Prize for the people who discovered it. And this is, I think, a good example of how you can get a nexus between the more cognitive level modeling and the neuroscientific modeling, where, for example, what O'Keefe and Nadel in the 70s were doing with place cells, their book was called The Hippocampus as a Cognitive Map. And they talked a lot about place cells, but they also talked about the cognitive map construct, and they were trying to connect the representational level with the neuroscientific level. And since then, there's been a lot of work in that vein. So I'm very excited, especially about this Bayesian modeling in cognitive science and the connections to neuroscience.
Well, there's a connection between your Bayesian work and representation as well. So I don't know. Let's start talking about representation, I suppose, and work our way there. So I'll be talking. Next episode, actually, we'll have interviewed Jørn Didriksen and Nico Kriegeskorte about representations in neural activity, and specifically like ways to encode and decode those representations at different levels of understanding and granularity. But okay, I'm going to summarize your worldview, and you can tell me where I'm wrong, and then we can dive deeper into the concepts. Okay.
Sure.
I mean, you've already been talking about, your love of all things Bayesian here, but okay. So you you like the computational theory of mind hypothesis, that we have these mental operations over symbols, and this can be encapsulated in the language of thought hypothesis, which describes the symbols and uses mentalese as the language in which our minds talk. So I think you were mentioning Helmholtz called it an idea. I think it was Helmholtz, and now we call it representation. Well, the mentalese for those two different words would be the same thing, right? Because it's sublingual in this case. Anyway, you also are a proponent of Turing style, a Turing style model of the mind, in that you can decompose mental processes into iterated elementary operations over symbols. But the Turing style often assumes, when people invoke it, that those symbols have no meaning. They're just governed by their intrinsic properties or syntactic properties. And we'll get into what all of this means in a few minutes here.
Yeah.
But that there are rules on them about, that govern the computation. However, you believe that computation can operate at the level of representation, not just at these formal syntactic rules levels. And one of the questions that you have is, what role can or does representation play in mental computation? What did I miss? Or what did I get wrong?
No, nothing exactly wrong. I would just maybe make a few caveats. So I definitely am interested in Turing-style models of the mind. I wouldn't exactly say I'm a proponent of them. I regard it more as a promising conjecture.
We need black and white here, man. We need black and white.
You're trying to make it more black and white. Than I do think that in some areas, the idea that something like Turing-style computation is going on, there's some strong considerations in favor of it. So, for example, there was a book by Randy Galstel and Adam King called, what was it called? Yeah, Memory and the Computational Brain, I think it was called. It came out about 10, 11 years ago. And that's something that they argue in that book at quite a lot of length, that for at least some phenomena, we're going to need something like a Turing machine model of the mind. Now, it's not going to be exactly like the simple Turing machines that you study when you take Introduction to Computability theory. It's going to differ in various ways. For example, like the most basic Turing machine that Turing himself had has an infinitely long tape, and like the mind is finite. It's not going to have an infinitely long tape. And there will be other differences as well. So, for example, one of the differences that they argue is that you're going to need addressable memory locations, whereas in a Turing machine, there's no addresses to the individual memory locations. The central processor just has to go from one memory cell to another one at a time, whereas in any modern computer, there's going to be addressable memory. Right. And they argue that the mind is going to be like that too. And they give a lot of empirical evidence for that, citing phenomena such as animal navigation.
Navigation, that's right.
Yeah.
They use dead reckoning, I think, as an argument, for instance. Go ahead, yeah. I'm just remembering the book.
That's absolutely right. Dead reckoning is one of their central examples. So I think that there's a lot to that, and it's something worth considering, at least in some areas of the mind. In terms of the issue of representation and syntax, let me talk a little bit about that.
Please.
So let me back up and just say a few things about the relation between representation and computation more generally, because I think that'll help to answer your question. The first point is that I think that virtually everyone who writes about this agrees that representation is foundational to computation in some way. So if you think about, for example, a Turing machine, just a really elementary Turing machine.
So let me just back. So we're talking about computation in the broadest sense now, right?
Yeah, the broadest sense. But I'm going to use Turing machines as an example, but you could make similar points if you were talking about neural networks. It's just it's easiest to give more computer sciencey examples to bring out the point I want to make. So you've got this Turing machine, and what's it doing? It's moving across the machine tape, and it's erasing symbols, writing symbols down. The symbols might be you might have a really simple artificial language just consisting only of stroke marks and strings of strokes. You could have a more complicated tape alphabet with a lot of more primitive symbols. Mm-hmm. But either way, all that it's really doing is computing over a formal language, a language that's composed of elementary signs that are concatenated or combined into strings. Now, the thing is that for most applications in computability theory, in AI, really almost anywhere, what we're interested in is computation over a non-symbolic domain, a domain that isn't the domain just of symbols or signs. So, for example, the case that people in the 1930s were most concerned with in the time that Turing was writing was computation over natural numbers, computing functions like addition, multiplication, subtraction, where you might, for example, divide one number into another. So here you're doing a computational operation over natural numbers, 0, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. So you've got to get from what the Turing machine is at its most basic level doing, which is manipulating symbols, to computation over a non-linguistic, non-symbolic domain. How are you going to do that? Well, you have to have a semantic interpretation for this. You have to treat the symbols as representing something. And similar point applies to other domains. So, for example, in computable analysis, you're studying computation over real numbers. And here you, again, have to have some kind of notation for real numbers. So you might use our familiar decimal notation for the real numbers that everyone learns in grade school. But there are many other possible notations for real numbers. And these actually support different notions of computability. You get that different functions are computable over the real numbers, depending on what notation system you use. So the point I'm just trying to make is that really, once you look beyond the most elementary case of computing over elements in an artificial language, you have to bring in some kind of idea of a notation or a representation relation. And the same applies if you broaden your attention from a mathematical domain to more empirical cases. In a more empirical case, for example, let's say you're trying to build a robot which is getting to navigate through its environment. So and this is something that people do, for example, with self-driving cars. Mm-hmm. So the robot needs to basically know where it is. So it's going to have something like a map or something like a representation of its environment encoded, and it's going to be doing computations over that. It's going to be updating it based on new information that it gets through its sensors. It's going to be exploiting this representation of the spatial layout. So you're going to have at some level of manipulation of symbols, or you could call them pieces of syntax in the robot. But you also, to fully understand the computations that the robot is doing, you have to understand that they're representing spatial locations, representing landmarks in the environment. So I think that for that reason, because of the kinds of considerations I'm giving, representation is central to understanding virtually every computation that one finds, unless you're looking at some case where it really is just computation over some kind of formal language.
So, I mean, this relates, and I was going to hold off until later, but since we're already talking about it, I think it's worthwhile just to spell out. So on the show, we often talk about Mars levels of analysis, and we'll talk about that in a few minutes, but there's a levels of computational explanation that is, it lays out computational understanding, explanation at three different levels: the representation, the syntactic, and the hardware. And we've been talking about these a little bit, but maybe we should be explicit about them before we move forward. Is that?
Absolutely. All right. Well, so let's take a concrete example. Let's say you have a machine of some sort, like a register machine or some kind of computational system that's doing just a strictly numerical computation. Say it's executing the Euclidean algorithm. So the Euclidean algorithm is the ancient algorithm for computing the greatest common divisor of two numbers. You plug in two numbers, it outputs the greatest common divisor. So here's one level that you could describe what this machine is doing. You could say, well, the machine divides one number to another, takes a remainder, does division again, takes a remainder, and it basically keeps on going until the remainder is 0. I mean, you have to spell that out a little more detail to actually get the algorithm, but that's in effect the Euclidean algorithm. So here you're describing it in terms of the computations that it's doing over numbers. So there's an implicitly representational aspect to your description because of what I was saying earlier, that the machine is manipulating symbols, and the symbols are not numbers. I mean, so just to be maybe more explicit, let's say just take the number 12, right? Mm-hmm. So the number 12 can be represented in many different ways. The number 12 could be represented using our familiar Arabic notation. You could use base 2 notation, base 3 notation. You could use Roman numeral notation. So you have the number, And then you have all these, what philosophers call numerals. So
Right.
the numerals are the different names you could have for the numbers. The numerals are in notation systems. And so to appreciate what I'm saying, you have to very sharply distinguish the number from the numerals. They're not they're not the same thing. So, but the number is like the abstract mathematical entity that mathematicians are studying. Then the numerals are the various names that we have for the number. And all the machine has inside of it, so to speak, is the numerals. But for the manipulations of the numerals to count as actually doing the Euclidean algorithm, doing this arithmetical computation, it has to be endowed with the semantics or with the representational relation to the numbers. So when you describe what this machine is doing with respect to numbers, that's an implicitly representational description. But now you don't have to describe it that way. You could say, look, forget about the semantics, forget about the number. Who cares about the number? I'm going to describe the purely syntactic level. I'm just going to say, you take this symbol, you take this numeral, you do this to it, you take this numeral, you do that to it. So that's what I would call a purely syntactic level, which is when you completely ignore any representational aspects. And finally, there's the hardware level, which is when you get into the actual physical construction of the machine, like what's going on with the silicon chips. And that's a level that an ordinary user of a computer would never care about too much. They would just never get involved in it. So usually you would just do either the representational or the syntactic level or some hybrid of them. But of course, if you want to build the machine or if the machine is broken and you need to get it fixed, then you're going to start to care a lot about the hardware level. So someone needs to care about it, but most ordinary users and computer programmers don't need to care about
it. The neuroscientists,
Well, yeah, exactly. So that's right. That's the analog to the neuroscience. So I'm going to get to that in a second. So the same thing applies if you are talking about other computations. So go back to this robot navigating, and just to be concrete, let's say that what the robot is doing a Bayesian inference to estimate where it is. And this is, so if you look at a lot of work on these autonomous vehicles and work on probabilistic robotics, this is the paradigm that's driving a lot of this work, is that something like a Bayesian inference is being, or approximation to a Bayesian inference is being executed. So there's a great textbook called Probabilistic Robotics, which talks all about these different Bayesian models of robot navigation. So one way you could describe what the robot is doing is in the representational terms. You could say, well, the robot is doing Bayesian updating over representations of spatial locations. Let's say it's using Cartesian coordinates to represent spatial locations. And that's a representational level description. You're bringing in how the robot represents the spatial layout. That it's like, well, it represents itself as being at this location. It represents the landmark as being at that location. And if you set up a Bayesian model, the natural way to think of the Bayesian model would be what the Bayesian model is basically the robot is attaching probabilities to hypotheses about its location, hypotheses about the locations of landmarks in its environment.
And is that what, just to hold there, is that where intentionality comes in and aboutness and meaning? I mean, are those yoked to the concept of representation at the representation level?
Yes, absolutely. Yes. I really consider most of those just almost different words for the same basic concept. I mean, if you read the philosophical literature, it's kind of the narcissism of small differences. These terms like intentionality, but they get used in a million different ways and people draw 1,000 differences. But yes, that's the core. It's all sort of the one core phenomena in some sense, the system is representing the world. Its states are about the world, and the term of art philosophers sometimes use is that they have intentionality.
Yeah.
But yeah, for me, I use these terms almost interchangeably.
You just used a phrase that I haven't heard that really encapsulates the side of philosophy that I don't enjoy, which is the narcissism of small differences. Is that a common phrase?
I think it's some kind of truism. I don't know if it's specifically to philosophy, but it's not a phrase that I coined, I don't think. But I mean, I think that. How should I put this? I was using it partly in response to some of the stuff you were saying at the beginning, because I was getting the sense that, when a lot of outsiders look at philosophy, that's kind of what they see. Because one of the main things that philosophers do is they draw distinctions. Philosophers are great at drawing distinctions. And sometimes it's really important to draw distinctions. And there are a lot of cases where I think work in cognitive science and neuroscience, maybe they should draw a few more distinctions. Not that it would necessarily change the model they give, but it might allow for greater clarity about the import of the model. But I think that for a practicing scientist, sometimes all this drawing of distinctions can seem a little bit picayune, a little bit ivory tower, not that really relevant to anything. So the phrase has a pejorative connotation, but I actually am someone who loves to draw distinctions. And
of course,
probably if people who read my paper, they might say, well, this is the narcissism of small differences. They might see that in some of my.
your papers from a scientific perspective read really well, by the way, but I interrupted you, so let's.
Yeah.
So robots navigating.
Yeah. No, I'm glad you did, because it gave us a chance to clarify that. But all right, so you got the robot. So you could describe it at the representational level, but then again, you could describe it at a syntactic level. You can describe just purely at the level of code, purely in terms of what sort of simple manipulation is going on in the robots, and you'll just ignore the fact that this has anything, in fact, to do with spatial representation. It's just a purely syntactic description. You can absolutely do that with the robot. And then, of course, you can also do a hardware description where you're just talking about the silicon chips and whatnot. Right. So all these levels have their value when you're studying an artificial computational system. People engage in all of these different levels of description, and they're, I would say, all vital for different purposes. Like, as I was saying before, the hardware description isn't that important for a lot of purposes, but it's very important if you need to build a machine or fix it. The representational level is crucial if you want to understand, like, why we built this machine. What is this machine actually doing? The syntactic level, it's a little more subtle to say why it's important, but I do think it plays an important level of giving an abstract level of description that isn't the hardware level description, but doesn't bog you down in all the representational detail. Yeah.
You think that, at least for artificial computing systems, and this is something I want to get into later, but not that the syntactic level is important, but that you can essentially skip it for biological or okay, I'll hold off because you're nodding.
No, that's right. I absolutely. Yeah, I mean, let's say that I'm skeptical. All these things, especially like when you write a paper, you publish it, you're like, yes, this is my view, but in practice, people are more, they're not as confident. But so I think that actually a good place a good entryway into what you just asked is to talk about the work of Jerry Fodor.
Sure.
So Jerry Fodor, definitely the most important philosopher of psychology of the last half decade, really seminal figure. And so Fodor was really pushed this idea of the mind as a computational system, especially as a Turing style system. That was integral to his whole picture. And so he developed this computational theory of mind as the mind as a computational system. And so Fodor's picture is that the mind is doing Turing style computations, and you get something exactly like these three levels of computational description that I was just describing to you. You get the representational level, you get the syntactic level, and you get the hardware level. In this case, the hardware level would be neuroscience, essentially. So the representational level would be, how does the mind represent the world as being? So, for example, let's say you go back to this jury example I gave earlier. You're on a jury and you decide, all right, the defendant is innocent. I've formed the belief that the defendant is innocent. And maybe you formed that on various pieces of evidence, like the DNA match was imperfect, or the eyewitness ID that the prosecutor put up was really pretty lame. They didn't use proper protocols for the eyewitness ID. Whatever. You've got this evidence and you formed the belief on the basis of it. So everything that I just described is essentially, for Fodor, and I agree with him, a representational level description. You have a belief about the defendant. So your belief is about the defendant. You are ascribing a property to the defendant, the property of being innocent. Maybe you're right, maybe you're wrong. It depends on if the defendant is really innocent or not, but you're representing the world as being a certain way. You're representing the world as being such that the defendant is innocent. So if you want to understand the nature of this mental state that you've entered into, you can't begin to do that unless you attend to its representational aspect, that this is a representational state. It's a state that represents the world as being a certain way. And it's a representational state that interfaces with a lot of other states, such as your grasp of the DNA evidence, your grasp of the eyewitness identification. Yeah. And the same applies not just to belief, but to perception. So let's say I look at a white wall. I say, oh, yeah, that wall is white. So I perceive the wall as being white. My perceptual state is about the wall. It's a representational state. So that's the importance of the representational level, is that these states do represent the world as being a certain way. And for Fodor, one of the key things you want to do is study the mind at this representational level. And then, of course, everyone agrees that you also need to eventually understand the hardware level, the neuroscientific level. That wasn't something Fodor was so interested in personally, but everyone agrees eventually you need to connect the representational level. Yeah. What did you say?
Eventually, yeah,
right, exactly. And that's a lot of what goes on in computational neuroscience. You could see it as doing that, or as steps towards doing that. So, but Fodor had this idea, as you alluded to, that the intermediate level is also important, the syntactic level, so that you're going to have not just the representational level description and the hardware neuroscientific level description, but also this middle level, the syntactic level. And I'm just not so sure how much this adds in the case of a biological computing system. When you have a mind that you found in nature, whether it's a human mind or an animal mind, at least I think in a lot of these cases that we're talking about, such as belief, such as perception, I suspect that it might be better to skip this and just go right from the representational level to the hardware level. And I think that's what you find when you look at scientific work on this. So one of Fodor's main arguments was he alleged that if you look at the cognitive science, what you see is this syntactic level all over the place. And I don't see that when I look. So for example, in this work on cognitive maps, that describing things as a cognitive map, that's like a representational level description. You're saying, here's this mental representation. This mental representation represents spatial layout of the environment. That's all, thoroughly representational level. And then one of the huge questions in this area is, how are cognitive maps neurally realized? And what are the neural processes that lead to the formation of a cognitive map? How does the cognitive map get revised? And you could study those questions at a more psychological cognitive level, and there's work on that. And you could also study it at the more neurophysiological level. And that's what this work on place cells and grid cells and things spinning off of that is contributing to. So there you have the representational level and the hardware level. But where's the syntactic level? There's nothing like that. There's nothing like these sort of pieces of meaningless syntax, the pieces of a formal language getting pushed around that you find in the study of, say, the register machine or the robot that we were talking before. Similarly, I would say for a lot of these Bayesian models that one finds, take Bayesian models of perception. I would describe a Bayesian model as a representational level description, because say you have a Bayesian model of perception, the most core idea of it is that you have this Bayesian inference that eventuates in a perceptual representation, let's say, of the color of some surface, the shape of some object. So you're describing the final perceptual state in representational terms. How does it represent the world as being? It represents the object as being a cube, not a sphere. It represents the surface as being white, not red.
Well, it represents it through like a probability distribution of features and things like that. And at the hardware level, anyway, there's a lot of work in the Bayesian world and doing things like sampling, as an approximation to a Bayesian process in brains. So that would be one example of a neural implementation of Bayesian.
Exactly.
Processes.
Well, 100%. And that's something I talk about in some of my work, is these sampling. I think that's some of the most promising approximation implementation models that have been proposed, in fact, the sampling model. I think you had Wolfgang Maas on your program recently, if I'm not mistaken, and he works on this topic, this neural implementation of Bayesian inference. Yeah. But this is another example where you have the representational level. Then how is this actually happening with neurons in the brain? And so you have the representational level, you have the neural level, but there's just nothing really like this syntactic level that Fodor is talking about. So I feel like I'm skeptical that this is going to have much value. I don't really see it playing much of a role in how practicing scientists are thinking about it. It seems kind of like the ether that they had in 19th century discussions of electromagnetism, sort of this construct that people, in this case philosophers, think they need because they've convinced themselves that it's mandated for some reason, but it's just an excrescence that should be expunged from the theorizing.
So while we're talking about syntactic and semantic, and levels of computational explanation, what I was going to ask you is, you're talking about cognitive science, and so Fodor's take when he looked at cognitive science is that he sees a lot of syntactic level explanations for things. Do I have that right?
Yeah.
But if I'm not mistaken, your take is that cognitive science perhaps has taken too much to heart the idea of the need for syntactic level has been inspired too much by artificial computation, in other words, and hasn't taken enough from what we understand about biological or mental computation. And you have this really nice paper that really lays it out, but maybe you can just talk a little bit about the difference between why you think syntactic level explanation might be appropriate for artificial systems, whereas representational level explanation might be more appropriate for biological systems.
Sure. I think the paper you're probably alluding to is the levels of computational explanation, I think it's called.
It is, yeah. And these will all be linked to in the show notes, of course. So
Great. So I'll just say, first of all, we were talking about the armchair. I don't think these are questions that can be settled from the armchair. I think these are ultimately empirical questions. You have to construct a theory that enshrines one or another way of looking at things and then play the theories off against each other. So but one of the flaws that I see in this philosophical literature is too much reliance on armchair argumentation. So you find Fodor and people influenced by Fodor often giving arguments, well, there just must be the syntactic level for some a priori reason. And I'm very skeptical of that. And the reason I'm skeptical of that is that when you're studying an artificial computational system, you're doing something very different than you have a different relation to it than when you're studying a biological system. Because one of the main reasons that we need the syntactic description for a artificial system is that it's functioning basically like a blueprint. It's describing how to build the machine. In some cases, how to program the machine. But it's something that we're using to build or manipulate or in some way construct and change the machine. And the value of the syntactic description is that it lets us do that, but it's very abstract. It doesn't get us into hardware details. So you could do this without having to worry about the silicon chips, because the computer programmer doesn't want to get into that. And maybe there are lots of different ways that you could, in principle, do a hardware implementation. You don't want to commit yourself. You don't know what resources you're going to have. You don't know what the physical machine is that is actually going to be built. You want to have this high level abstract blueprint of it that doesn't get you into the hardware, but at the same time isn't representational, where you're not getting bogged down in these philosophical questions about intentionality and aboutness and, well, what exactly would it take to bestow these representational properties? And you don't have to get into that because it's just purely syntactic. So when you give the syntactic description, it's really I think that David Chalmers has a really nice paper on this. I forget the name of it. I think it's called Varieties of Computation or something like that. It came out about 7 or 8 years ago. And I think it was a reply to a bunch of articles by people that were basically critiquing him. And then his Varieties of Computation is his reply to those people. And what he says there is that it's sort of the syntactic level gives you this sweet spot between the representational and the hardware level, where it's abstracted away from these hardware details, but it's not getting you into these representational aspects either. And I think there's something.
Go ahead. Well, in that respect, it's multiply realizable. It has multiple realizability features, right?
Yes. That's the terminology philosophers use for that kind of description. Is that it's multiply realizable. So the representational and multiply realizable means that there are many different ways of physically realizing it.
You could do it with neurons or Tinker Toys or whatever.
Yeah, exactly. And representational and syntactic description are both multiply realizable, but the syntactic description is just a lot easier to deal with for a lot of purposes, for the reasons I was indicating earlier. But the thing is that when you look at a biological computing system, a natural computing system like the human mind or like say the mind of a rodent, we're not building it. We don't need a blueprint for it, not a literal blueprint, because it's not something we're constructing. Yeah, it's given. I mean, if we start to construct it, then maybe it will change. But we're not constructing it now, right? We just have it, and we're trying to understand how it works on its own terms. So it's given to us. It is doing these computations, which we can understand in representational terms. Understand, for example, the rat as navigating through space, as representing the spatial layout of its environment. But really what we want to understand is precisely the hardware details that we don't care about so much when we're building the physical machine. Like, that's what we care the most about for the rat is how is this being done in the actual rodent brain? That's the $1 million question that everyone is trying to answer. So in the case of the building the machine, of course, someone needs to care. Some computer engineer somewhere needs to care. And we're very grateful to them for doing that. But for many, many purposes, like we don't care. We don't want to have to deal with it. We want to know how to program it, how to work at the much more syntactic level. But when we're studying a pre-given mind, the whole thing that we care about is how this thing gets implemented in the hardware level. And so I'm not sure that you have as much of a need for the syntactic description. And I think that the course of the science kind of bears out this somewhat a priori consideration that I was just going through, because as I was saying before, you don't in fact find people giving anything like this syntactic description. So that's the basic argument of that paper. And in some of my other work, I try to explore some of the ins and outs of this a little bit more, but that's the gist of it.
So we're kind of circling through these topics, and if it's okay, let's circle back and talk about representation writ large or in general for a moment here. So, yeah. I mean, so the concept of representation, like you have already discussed, it has been and continues to be this huge philosophical playground, essentially. And so let me just talk about a few ways that representation is used in neuroscience and AI, maybe, and then we can bring in the philosophy perspective here. So in neuroscience, I feel like the concept of representation has been sort of diluted over the years, in that there's a dilution over the individual neuron contribution, essentially. So, we started studying tuning curves, right, and grandmother cells, these individual neurons and what they responded to feature-wise. And then it sort of, diluted a little bit, and now we talk about mixed selectivity and population codes. So there's neurons that contribute a little bit to a lot of functions, and tuning curves don't necessarily match the neuron's contribution. Just because the neuron is firing highest, looking at a white wall doesn't mean that neuron is encoding white walls, for instance. So in an AI, and there's more to say about all of this, of course, so I'm just touching on it, but in AI, representation is used mostly when talking about the activity of a layer in a neural network, in like a deep neural network, right? So you have a layer of a bunch of, like some given hidden layer, right? Sure. Or any layer. So the concept of a representation is obvious in like an input layer. The representation is at the image pixel value level, for instance. And it's pretty obvious at the output layer, where you represent the different probabilities of the different categories that the neural network is functioning to, say whether it's a tree or a car, for instance, and the probability that it's a tree or a car. And you have these output units that represent those probabilities. But then in the hidden units, it gets messy. And this is the idea of this parallel distributed processing, where then you still have a representation in number form in the units and their activation levels, but what they're representing at that point gets a little hazier anyway. So I don't know that's a great summary, but at the neuroscience and AI level, but maybe in broad strokes, could you describe the concept of representation and in philosophy and in sort of how it's evolved?
Yeah, sure, absolutely. In philosophy, as in these other fields like AI and neuroscience, I think the word gets used in different ways. Representation. People have different conceptions of representation. But I would say that by and large, the most central concept of representation in philosophy has been the idea that the mind represents the world as being a certain way. And this is really the essence of representation. So go back to the jury example. I formed the belief the defendant is innocent. So I now represent the defendant as being innocent. So you can look at my belief and compare it with reality and say, is my belief true or is it false? Mm-hmm. So you can evaluate the belief for truth or falsity. You could say the belief is true under some conditions. It's true under the condition that the defendant is innocent, false under the condition that he's not innocent, that he actually did it. So this is what you could call a truth conditional conception of representation, where you think of the essence of representation as being you represent a reality as being some way, and that makes the representational state the kind of thing you could evaluate, is it true or not? So this you find this conception really going back all the way through the history of philosophy, going back to the medieval era. But I think especially in the work of Kant, it starts to come to the fore. And then really it starts to come to the fore in the late 19th century. So one of the central figures here is a late 19th century German philosopher and logician named Gottlob Frege, whose greatest claim to fame is that he invented modern logic. So all the modern logic that's taught, in every university in the country, throughout the world, and that's forms the basis for a lot of the stuff that goes on in AI, especially the early 1960s AI. Right. All of that comes from Frege. And so at Frege, this was Frege's starting point, essentially what I just said. He didn't put it in quite the terms I just used, but this is essentially how he looked at it. The essence of mental representation is that the representational state can be evaluated as true or not. And then you mentioned Bertrand Russell earlier. Russell definitely signed on to this. And finally, the third seminal figure here, many of your listeners will have heard of, is Ludwig Wittgenstein. So Frege, Russell, Wittgenstein essentially all agreed on this, despite many things they disagreed about. And they all gave very interesting theories that were essentially trying to understand mental representation in these terms, the representational aspect of the mind in the terms I was just laying out. And what you found over the past century of work so analytic philosophy is the term people often use for the kind of philosophy that essentially stems from Frege, Russell, and Wittgenstein. But it's just this style of philosophy that draws upon their ideas and their approach. And it's mainly what's practiced in the United States and in the United Kingdom and Australia, and also in many parts of Europe as well. So in analytic philosophy, you've seen increasingly sophisticated and elaborate developments and refinements of this idea. Just one thing I want to mention here is that one of the main things that Frege contributed here, and Russell and Wittgenstein also had a hand in this, is the idea that because you have these states that can be evaluated as true or false, you can give what is called a semantic. So if you take a sentence like, the defendant is innocent, that's composed of words, and the words are meaningful. And the meanings of the words contribute to the meaning of the whole sentence. And so you know what a defendant is, you know what it is for him to be innocent. And then that is what basically determines the conditions under which the sentence is true or not. So what you're doing in what's called formal semantics is you're trying to understand how the meanings of the component words, the representational properties of the component words, contribute to the truth conditions, or to the conditions under which the overall sentence is true. So this was something that is quite big in logic, it's quite big in linguistics. It's essentially doing this formal semantics, trying to pick apart a sentence into its component parts, and then look at how the semantic representational properties of the component parts contribute to the representational import of the overall sentence. And what Frege definitely wanted to do, what Russell and Wittgenstein, Russell, I'm not so sure about Wittgenstein, but Russell to a large extent wanted to do, and what many subsequent people wanted to do, is to apply a similar picture to thought. That just like a sentence is structured, thought too is structured. There's some kind of like logical structure to high level thought, at least, that mirrors the high level structure of a sentence. And just like you can give a semantics for a sentence, so too you can give something like a semantic compositional analysis of thought. And that's something that many philosophers such as Fodor have tried to spin off on. Now you asked for so that's just like the very capsule summary of sort of how philosophers are looking at it. And then a lot of the work is trying to the work that goes on in analytic philosophy is trying to spell that out and look at a lot of problem cases and so on. And we could talk more about some of those ramifications in a moment, but just to answer all of your question, because you're asking about comparison with notions of representation that you find in these other areas, I think that sometimes you find this conception playing a role. I mean, at least maybe it's a little bit more implicit than explicit. It's not like people would put things in exactly the terms that I put them. But I think in a lot of cognitive psychology, you see people drawing upon this approach as a source of ideas, or at least as a sort of benchmark for how they're looking at it. I think some of the early work in AI, but some of the more like classical AI before you get to the neural network type distributed representation you were alluding to, but some of the old like 1960s stuff drew upon this approach, and you still see some stuff that draws on it, although I agree with you that it's not as big now.
It's coming back though.
Yeah, that's the thing. There are these cycles to it, right? Yeah. And then I think that in neuroscience, I have a harder time saying in what notion of representation is at play in neuroscience. I agree with you that I think the word diluted is a good word for it, because sometimes it seems to be a kind of anemic conception where talking about representation is almost just kind of a florid way of talking about some kind of correlation, say, between neural activity and things that are going on in the environment. And people will use these words like represent and encode, but really it's just a gloss, and it could be rephrased. You could just talk about things like mutual information and correlations and stuff like that without bringing in the concept of representation at all. So, for example, with place cells. So a place cell is basically a cell that preferentially fires when the rat is in a certain location. And this was what was discovered in the early 1970s, that there were these place cells. And people will sometimes say in this literature, well, the place cell represents the rat's spatial location. But they don't say, well, what does that mean? What does it mean to say that what are you really adding to your description when you say it represents, as opposed to just giving a really super accurate description of what property in the distal environment correlates with what pattern of neural firing? Because if all you have is these correlations, that doesn't add up to anything like the Sprague-Russell-Wittgenstein conception of representation. Right. My colleague Tyler Burge has a book called Origins of Objectivity, where he talks a lot about this, how this more traditional philosophical conception relates to these other conceptions where you would bring in something like information and correlations with the environment. So one other book I'll just mention is a very recent book, is a book called Representation in Cognitive Science by Nicholas Shea. And that book is, a lot of it is about representation as it figures in neuroscience. And I mean, the book is called Representation in Cognitive Science, but a lot of his examples really are from neuroscience. Yeah. And he has a sort of analysis of what notion of representation is in play in a lot of these kinds of examples, some that you were alluding to, examples like the place cell. And that it's basically giving a kind of philosophical elucidation of what notion of representation neuroscientists are using in some of these passages.
You're talking teleosemantics now, because we're not going to get into teleosemantics. No, man.
we're not going to get into it, but he gets into it. Yeah. So, but anyway, so I guess I would just say, like, as a sort of a global summary of the answer to your question, is that I think that there are different notions of representation in play. It's a term that's so general that it can be used to mean different things, and the most important thing, if you're a philosopher or a scientist or anyone, is just to be clear about what notion you have in mind and what you mean when you're talking about representation. That's what I try to do whenever I write about this, is to always signal what I have in mind. So to just do, clarify that I'm trying to affiliate what I'm doing with this Sprague or Russell Wittgenstein tradition. There are other notions of representation that are out there. So, for example, Gallisto, who I mentioned earlier, he has a different notion as well that has some connections to these different notions, but really I think is orthogonal to them. So it's not that, like, my usage I think is any better or more legitimate than other people's usages. It's just that that's my usage, and I try to be explicit about that's how I'm using it.
So I guess I was going to ask you, like, what's the right level of granularity to consider something a quote-unquote representation? Because in the analytical philosophy, you need these sort of individuated, I guess, entities, right? These single things that stand for things that then you can compare to other things. But then if in a distributed system, it's diluted. You don't have that anymore. But do you still call that a representation? And I don't know. I guess what you're saying is you can define it however you want it in the terms in your own paper. Right.
Yeah, I mean, I wouldn't exactly say anything goes. I think I think there's a small family of notions here, some of which I was alluding to, and you kind of want to just kind of clarify which one you're using. But yeah. So I mean, right.
Like a mentalese word, right? In the language of thought, what would count in mentalese as a representation? Does it need to be a very defined entity, or can it be a collection of things?
All right, so let me first just say, maybe I should just say a little bit about this idea of mentalese,
please,
because it may not be familiar to, and then I will answer. All right.
I often assume way too much from the listeners, so
yeah. So let me say just a word about that, and then I'll try to answer your question to some extent. But really, I'm just stalling answering your question. That's really what I'm doing. So, all right. So this is an idea that goes back to the medieval era. So William of Ockham. So everyone's heard of Occam's razor. So William of Ockham was really the person who helped to crystallize this idea. And so Occam's idea is that just like we speak in a natural language, so too when we think in a mental language. And he called this the language of thought. And nowadays people call this mentalese, just by analogy with English. Mm-hmm. So the idea would be, so natural language like English has words, and the words can compound into sentences. So like the sentence, whales are mammals. There's the word whale, there's the word mammal. You compound it into a sentence, whales are mammals. And the idea is the same thing is going on, or something analogous is going on at the mental level. You have mental words, like you have a mental word whale, you have a mental word mammal. And when you form a belief that whales are mammals, what you've done is you've compounded those words together into a mentalese sentence. And the sentence is meaningful, just like the English sentence is meaningful. And so basically on this view, having a belief is a matter of standing in the right relation to some mentally sentence. So when I form the belief the defendant is innocent, then I have a mentally sentence the defendant is innocent. It's got these component words corresponding at least roughly to the English word. So mentalese is this system of mental representations which operates something like a natural language in the sense that you have something like words, they combine together into something like a logical structure, and then you could give something like a semantics for mentalese, just like you give a semantics for English or for any natural language. Mm-hmm. Okay, so that's an idea that was very popular in the medieval era. It fell on hard times. The period philosophers called the early modern era, which is essentially the period beginning with Descartes. You still have people talking about mental representations, but they thought of it more in imagistic or pictorial terms. They thought of like the idea would be something like you're thinking about a triangle, so you have something like a mental image of a triangle. So it really lapsed out of popularity. Really, no one was talking at all about this idea of a language of thought. And then in the early 20th century, basically the first half of the 20th century, no one was talking about mental representations at all, whether they were mentalese or mental images. People were just very skeptical about these things, partly under the influence of behaviorism. So you had this ascendancy of behaviorism in philosophy and psychology, and all this talk about mental representations really, not entirely, but to a large extent, fell by the wayside. With the cognitive science revolution, it comes back with a vengeance, and you find people just all over the place positing mental representations. So Jerry Fodor writes this book in 1975. He calls it the language of thought. It's this very explicit attempt at reviving this old medieval idea, but now combined with the computational theory of mind. So now it's that, well, you're doing mental computations over this language of thought, and the computations are operating over symbols in the language of thought. And he offers support from cognitive science for this idea of mental representation. So he's giving a more empirical support for this old medieval view, and he's also giving it more substance by combining it with this Turing-style model of computation. And you also find more non-linguistic conceptions of mental representation proliferating as well. So this work on cognitive maps is an example. Edward Tolman proposed cognitive maps in 1948. They didn't get much uptake at that point, but in the 1970s, especially with the work of O'Keefe and Nato, more and more people start talking about them. So it's not just language-like representations. It's also cognitive maps. People talk about mental images again. They talk about mental diagrams. So a whole plethora of different kinds of different representational formats, different kinds of mental representations. And that I see as a very central thought for a lot of cognitive science. Okay, now, do you want to ask about that, or do you want to follow up, or do you want me to answer your question about the
go for it.
Okay.
Yeah.
Okay. So the granularity question. So sort of what counts as a mentalese word? So this is the question I was stalling answering because I don't really know the answer. No one really knows the answer.
Yeah.
But I maybe we'll just say a few things to give a conceptual framework that I use at least to think about, because I think a lot about the question you just asked. I think about it like every day. And these are just the basic terms that I think about it, and that may be helpful to some of your listeners. So I think there's a really key distinction here. This is where we're talking about philosophers drawing distinctions. And this is a place where distinction can really, really be helpful. And this is what philosophers call the type token distinction. So what this comes to is the following. Let's take an English sentence, like the sentence, the defendant is innocent. Okay, so I just uttered that sentence. The defendant is innocent. So there's this type. The sentence is this, it's like an abstract entity. What the philosophers call a type. And the reason it's an abstract entity is that it's an entity that doesn't really exist in space and time, because it can be instantiated on many different occasions, really on arbitrarily different occasions. So I can say the defendant is innocent. The defendant is innocent.
The defendant is innocent.
The defendant, yeah. Again. And what philosophers say is that those are different tokens of the same type. So this is the type, there's the abstract entity, the sentence. And then you have different tokens of that same type. Just like if I were to go and write on the blackboard 100 different times, I write the letter A. How many letters are on that blackboard? Well, in a sense, there's just one letter. There's the one letter type A. But in another sense, there's 100 because there's 100 tokens of the letter A. So to answer a question like how many you have to say, are you talking about types or tokens? Just like you've got, 5 different copies of Moby Dick on your bookshelf. How many books are on your bookshelf? Well, there's 5 tokens of the single book type, Moby Dick. So the book is an abstract type, but it has different tokens.
And is the type an ontological entity, or is that an open thing that we shouldn't go down?
No, I mean, I think the most useful way of looking at it is that, yes, it's a real entity. There are philosophers who would deny that. Okay. I mean, there are philosophers who would say, oh, why do we need to believe in these things? I don't believe in them. Yeah. But I think that in general, we're okay with positing abstract entities like numbers, natural numbers, real numbers, sets. You can't really do set theory unless you believe that there are sets, right? So you can't do arithmetic unless you're talking about numbers. So in general, we're okay talking about numbers. One of the best discussions I've seen of this is a book by Linda Wetzel called, it's just a book called Types and Tokens, which is essentially a book-long argument. Look, you should be okay with talking about the type as a real entity in its own right. Don't scruple to posit it. Just go ahead and endorse the fact that this thing exists along as a genuine entity. So that's the way I'm going to talk, because I'm convinced by her. I think she's right. I think there's a lot of reasons for believing this. Okay, so that's the distinction, the type token distinction. So now apply the type token distinction to the mind. So now I don't say the defendant is innocent. I form the belief the defendant is innocent.
I think it. Yep.
Yeah, I think it. So again, there's a type. There's from a language of thought viewpoint, there's the mentalese type. There's this mental sentence. The defendant is innocent. I'm thinking it. Maybe the other jurors, hopefully the other jurors on the jury are thinking it. If they're convinced by the same evidence, they'll be thinking of it. And there's this single mentalese type that I'm instantiating and they're instantiating. So now what are the tokens of the type? Well, the tokens would be something like some kind of presumably pattern of neural firing or pattern of neural activity in my brain, in their brain. So there's my token, there's their token. So then what are these tokens? Well, I mean, that no one knows. That's the short answer. It doesn't have to just be like a single neuron. It could be a distributed pattern of neural firing. It could be something that we haven't even thought about yet about going on in the brain. No one knows the answer to the question. From the cognitive science, cognitive psychology point of view, what you're doing is more positing that there are these types and that we instantiate them, and that treating the mind as instantiating these types is a useful way of taxonomizing or classifying mental states for purposes of explanation. But I mean, so the question you ask, one way of rephrasing it using this type token distinction is what needs to be in place for a neural event or for a neural occurrence, for a pattern of neural firing to count as the token of a mentalese type. And I mean, that's a tremendously hard question. And you can see how hard it is just by reflecting on the case of natural language. So think about an utterance in English. What needs to be in place for my utterance of some sounds to count as a token of an English sentence? I mean, or just a word, like for me to utter like the word dog, what needs to be in place for that to count as an utterance of an English word? You could have it's not just the sound, right? It's that you can't just look at the way that things sound. So for example, if I say John went to the bank, well, I could mean he went to the financial institution.
That's the bank, yeah.
Or I could mean that he went to the riverbank. And you can't read off which word I uttered just from the sounds. That's not enough because it's the same sound. So the type token relation, what are the tokens of the type? What needs to be in place for the tokens to count as tokens of a given type? Even for the case of English, for language, which we understand so much better than thought, we don't really know the answer to that question. It maybe has something to do with the speaker's intentions. What was I trying to say when I said John went to the bank? Something about the role that the utterance plays in the larger linguistic practice. But this is a question philosophers have worked on, including my colleague David Kaplan has a paper or two on this question. But like no one has a definitive answer. So even for the case of English, which is so much better understood than thought, we can't really answer the question. So it's not surprising, therefore, that in the case of the mind, we can't really answer the question either. So I would just say your question is a great question, but it's a wide open question that we just don't know. And it's going to take work, I think, by neuroscientists, by philosophers, by cognitive psychologists. It's going to take work from all these different vantage points to really get really concrete, satisfying answers to the question that you're asking. I
mean, I know that language is something that you're interested in, and I don't think we're going to have time, but your dissertation was on what was it? I have the... Oh, hang on, let me just read it. Is thought explanatorily prior to language? And I mean, I've been thinking about language a lot lately, and I don't need to go on and on about this, but I had not thought about what you just described in terms of types and tokens with respect to once the waveform is collapsed and the language comes out, and then mapping the meanings onto what is actually said. I was thinking of it in terms of, so there is language, which is spoken, And once it's spoken, it is a collapsed waveform, quote unquote, right? So, but then you can take a step back and in your head, and you can go into like the mental rehearsal of saying the words, before actuating them through your motor processes. Sure. And then it gets more diluted, and then you have these distributed probabilities and how they come together. Is that a representation? And then it just gets messier and messier. So, So I want to draw a line somewhere, and I don't know. I mean, you don't know. No one knows.
Draw a line between
what's a representation and what's not. What counts, right?
I see. Right.
As the representation of this person's innocent, for instance. And by the way, I'm wondering what horrible crime you committed that these things are on your mind so much.
Yeah. So I think that in the example that you're giving, there's going to be multiple levels of representation throughout the cognitive system.
Yeah.
So first of all, you have to have if you take a simple case, I have a belief, I want to communicate it to you. And then you're going to hear what I say, you're going to process it. So there's going to be representations in my mind and representations in your mind. There's going to be first just my mental representation of just the belief that I'm trying to communicate. Then there's got to be at some level of the cognitive system, some representation of the syntactic, semantic properties of the language that I'm going to use. And that needs to be in place for me to convert my belief into which sentence am I actually going to utter? And this is something that, in generative linguistics, it's all about exactly what are these properties that are represented. And then that once I decided to utter, it's not maybe me who's decided to utter the sentence. It's more maybe some subpersonal process. But once my cognitive system, broadly speaking, has decided to.
You can say free will. Once your free will has decided to.
I've decided to utter the sentence.
Yeah.
But then my motor system, now I need to move my mouth and so on, produce sound. And that's a whole other conundrum that my motor system needs to solve. And that's, a very difficult question. That's why one of the reasons it takes kids a while to start really speaking well is that their motor systems are learning how to do this. So, and I think there's going to be representations there as well, that representations involving, the state of the lips, the positions of the lips and things like that are going to be drawn on to convert the intention to utter the sentence into an actual pattern of motor movement in your speech production mechanisms. So I think there's going to be a lot of different representations, and at some point it's going to shade into something which looks non-representational. At some point it's going to shade into just here you have the motor command just being sent by the brain to your vocal production apparatus. But where exactly to draw that line, I don't think anyone really knows the answer exactly to that. And you're going to have a parallel process going on in the part of the hearer, which is that they're going to be receiving the sound, and they're going to have to then, decode it. They're going to have to draw on their syntactic knowledge of the language in order to understand what was said. And then that hopefully will be converted into a belief. So you'll have it'll be almost a symmetrical process, maybe.
Well, it sounds like we're all going to have plenty of work ahead of us.
Yes.
All right, in these last few minutes, I'm going to open it up here and get a little broader, if that's okay with you.
Yeah, absolutely.
Do you think Turing would agree with you about the syntactic versus representational nature of a Turing-like process? That I know you can't be black and white on the mind is a Turing machine, but what would you think he would think about it?
I've wondered about that, and I don't know. I think it's hard to know what he would think. I guess I would just say Turing was a brilliant logician and a brilliant thinker, one of the greatest thinkers of the 20th century.
That's a safe statement.
Yeah, that's a safe statement. But I don't think he was very sophisticated about philosophy of mind. So, for example, besides inventing the Turing machine, the thing that Turing is the most famous for is the Turing test.
Oh, which I'm sure let's not do it. No.
Yeah, well, exactly. I'm sure all your listeners are familiar with what that is. I'm not even going to describe it.
I threw up a little bit in my mouth just now.
Yeah, well, exactly. The Turing test is basically a sort of warmed over behaviorist outlook. So when I teach the Turing test, when I teach philosophy of mind, and I'm quite critical of it when I teach it, because I think it's not very philosophically sophisticated. So I think that if you wanted to talk about philosophy of mind with him, you would have to first kind of eradicate a lot of the latent behaviorism that seems to be informing the way he's thinking about it. So it's hard for me to know where he would come out once you've done all that, because that would be such a big discussion.
Do you think he would just be against those symbols having an intentionality, a representational quality to them, that just no need? I guess that's what you're saying. You don't know.
I feel like I don't really know,
Yeah.
but I feel like he might just not think that was a very useful way of describing it in the first place, possibly.
What's like just in your sort of day-to-day work, what do you find sort of most challenging? What kind of in terms of running up against obstacles, or just mentally taxing, or like what's a bottleneck of your time?
Well, I think that for me personally, there are two things that are challenging. One is that, as we've been indicating, the work I do is it's not exactly interdisciplinary, but it draws a lot upon other disciplines. I mean, everything I do is philosophy, but it's philosophy that's informed by a lot of other areas. So we talked about cognitive science. Some of my work on foundations of Bayesian decision theory draws quite a lot on probability theory. Some of the work I did on computational theory of mind, I was reading a lot of computer science, computability theory, and a lot. These are areas in which I'm not an expert. Like, I'm not trained in them. I don't have a PhD in these areas. My PhD is in philosophy. I've studied all these subjects to some extent, do coursework on them, but that's a lot different than actually getting a, graduate level PhD work in it. So there's often a big knowledge gap that I need to hurdle, different, disciplinary frameworks, different assumptions. I have to sort of trace back through the literature to understand more basic stuff, to then go back and think about. So I need to make sure I understand what I'm reading, at least at a reasonable level, so then I can digest it. I can communicate it to philosophers so that they'll feel like they understand it. The philosophers.
Yeah. So do you find yourself, like, when you contemplating whether you should go down a particular avenue because you know how much fucking effort it's going to take to get over to establish all these principles and stuff? Do you sit at the beginning of the road and look down it and think, oh, I don't know, is it worth it?
I probably should do that more, but I mean, that's the great thing about having tenure, is that you can go down some rabbit hole and maybe it doesn't pay off, but you spent a year of your life on it, and it's like, okay, whatever, I still have tenure. So you're not gonna ruin your life by doing that. So I probably am a little foolhardy in saying, okay, I'm just gonna read this probability theory textbook and try to understand it and do what I can. So I mean, it's definitely a challenge, because I mean, at the end of the day, I have to not just digest it, but also then write a genuine philosophy paper. So when I'm writing about, say, philosophy of cognitive science, I'm hoping at least not to just write a book report, like here's what scientists are saying, but to actually do a philosophical analysis of it that will be helpful to philosophers, maybe helpful to some scientists. So I have to digest it and then assimilate it and do the philosophy. And then this is the other main challenge, which is just that I find, at least, that philosophy is really hard. I find this in my teaching. I find it in my research. I'm continually struggling with just how to write a good paper, how to wrap my mind around the difficulty of the topics I'm working on. I know my students often find my philosophy very hard. Maybe it's just my poor teaching, but I think it's hard for a lot of professionals. It's just hard to sit. You're not doing any lab work. There's no, when you're doing philosophy, you're just sitting and thinking.
And you're not just thinking, but you're thinking about 1,000 different pieces that are all interacting. That is very hard.
Yeah, it's very hard. If I didn't love it so much, I couldn't bring myself to get up and do it every day. But because just those two things, I think, are the most challenging for me.
This is always a fun one that no one wants to answer. It's about consciousness. Do you think that cracking the mental representation problem, how do mental representations get their aboutness, their meaning, was that going to help crack the consciousness problem? Understanding consciousness? By problem, I mean understanding consciousness. Or are they orthogonal?
So I come down on the side of thinking that they are most likely orthogonal. So that, just to give a little context. So the mental representation problem that you're alluding to is, look, we agree minds do represent. They have the capacity to represent, but how does that come about? Yeah. What is it about the mind or the brain or its situation in the world that gives it the capacity to represent? What needs to happen for some neural state to then be about the world? So that's the mental representation problem, or what in philosophy sometimes people call it the problem of intentionality. Then the consciousness problem. Now, consciousness, again, is one of these words that can mean so many different things. But nowadays, usually, partly under the influence of David Chalmers' discussions, when people talk about consciousness, usually what they have in mind is the so-called qualitative aspect of experience. So that would be like when you get hurt, like you have a pain. There's something that it feels a certain way to have that pain. In the formulation that Thomas Nagel used, there's something that it's like to have that pain. So that's the sort of qualitative aspect. You can't really quite put into words what it's like, but everyone who's felt pain knows it. And so that's this qualitative aspect. And trying to elucidate that qualitative aspect is something that philosophers have really wrestled with. And I tend to have the view that probably these are pretty separate phenomena, and understanding one is not going to help too much with understanding the other. But I think we understand so little about consciousness in particular that I would not be surprised to learn I was wrong either.
Recently, I was listening to something about Sartre and Camus, and the existentialism flooded back into me. I think that was my introduction to philosophy. Does existence precede essence? Michael Rescorla?
I'm going to skip that one.
This is black or white. All right, good. You give me no degrees. Anything that you can think of that, in your opinion, is getting too much hype or too much focus or too much funding, for instance?
Well, one thing I'll mention, just because I've basically said as much in print already, so I'm not really saying too much, okay, is that one research program that's getting a lot of attention in philosophy right now is so-called predictive coding, which is a particular framework for, one way you could think of it as a framework for understanding how the mind might approximately implement Bayesian inference, although predictive coding doesn't necessarily have to be done in Bayesian terms either. But in particular, there's a version of predictive coding espoused by Carl Friston, the so-called free energy approach, which is getting a lot of attention. And I'm not opposed to people doing research on this in science. I think, all conjectures should be pursued. But in philosophy, it's getting a lot of attention, which I think is disproportionate to the empirical success that this approach has had so far. So there's a lot of workshops on predictive coding. A lot of people are writing articles about it.
Philosophy workshops.
Yeah. Philosophers talk. Yes, exactly. Philosophers talking about like what philosophical morals can be drawn from predictive coding, and people writing books about it. And I just think this is a little bit premature. I don't really see that much in this research program that warrants the quite extensive amount of philosophical attention that it's getting. And here I would contrast this predictive coding idea with the more generic idea, just that the mind does some form of Bayesian inference, and especially that the perceptual system does some form of Bayesian inference. There, I see there's quite a lot of good evidence for this, and this has had a lot of really impressive explanatory successes. So I kind of wish that some of the philosophers talking about predictive coding would talk more just about generic Bayesian approaches to perception. So it's not so much against the funding or the research that scientists are doing in their laboratories. It's more, I just feel this has maybe been a little bit overhyped, overemphasized in the philosophical community. And I'd like to see more attention, more resources being spent on these other approaches that I think are a little more promising.
You're not only in print, you participated in a 4-person, I guess, debate on predictive coding that's on YouTube, and I'll link to it. But you lay out your position well there too. So I'll point people that way. Finally, Michael, what's something that you used to believe that you now think is naive or wrong?
I used to be more skeptical about the value of neural networks. So I was really influenced by Jerry Fodor, and Fodor was really, really hostile to neural networks. And, probably many of your listeners will be familiar with these debates about connectionism and this famous...
Fodor's he's like an enemy in...
That Fodor... I still think that these connectionist models that Fodor and Pavlishin were talking about were maybe a bit overhyped and not as good as some of the classical models they were contrasting them with. But I'm much more impressed now by the power of neural networks. And this is partly just due to the fact that the fields are evolving. So you look at the latest developments in AI, things like deep learning. It's partly because I just know a lot more about neural networks than I did, say, when I was a grad student. But I mean, certainly if you look at a lot of the work that's being done now in computational neuroscience, and especially this relatively recent initiative, I guess you could call it, of cognitive computational neuroscience, which now they have their own conference, and people that are working under that umbrella or affiliate themselves with that label. The work such as, for example, work on how you might implement Bayesian inference in a neural network. Yeah. I think that a lot of that work is quite impressive. So I think that maybe it's not exactly that I believe something that was wrong, but I was a little bit more pessimistic than I am now about the power of neural networks. I think now it's clear that neural network modeling can really contribute a lot to understanding how some mental processes are neurally realized. And, I still agree with Fodor and Pollution, and then also with this book by Galistone King, that this more classical picture that emphasizes Turing machines is helpful and is really in fact needed in a lot of cases. So, but I guess I just have a more ecumenical viewpoint. Well, that's valuable looking at some phenomena, some levels of description. The neural network approach is more valuable. It is valuable in other cases. So it's just maybe a little bit more ecumenical, less pessimistic about the neural network framework.
I mean, we all want the same thing. We can all be friends because we're all vying for the same thing. And that's a good read, actually, that Galistone King book, by the way. I think.
Oh, yeah.
It's been a while. Well, Michael, this has been really fun. I have like 1,000 more things to get to, but I really appreciate your time. I've taken you over, as I tend to do, so I appreciate you going a little overtime with me. And thanks for taking me down the philosophical path, man. This has been fun.
Thank you so much for having me on. It's really been a pleasure to talk to you.
Brain Inspired is a production of me and you. You can support the show through Patreon for a microscopic $2 or $4 per month. Go to braininspired.co and find the red Patreon button there. Your contribution will help sustain and improve the show and prohibit any annoying advertisements like you hear on other shows. To get in touch with me, email paul@braininspired.co. The music you hear is by The New Year. Find them at thenewyear.net. Thanks for your support. See you next time.
We've left our heyday, searching the coffers for empty offers. I don't know why you trust the sky. Must like your life.